One quiet morning in the small town of Kokomo, Indiana, a 13-year-old boy named Ryan White woke up to the sound of birds outside his window, unaware that his journey would one day inspire millions, because though he was born with hemophilia, a disorder that made his blood unable to clot, Ryan carried himself like any other boy, full of laughter, dreams, and a love for sports, never imagining that a simple medical treatment meant to help him would change the course of his life forever. For during one of his hospital visits he received a blood transfusion that carried a hidden danger, the virus called HIV, which at that time in the 1980s was feared, misunderstood, and surrounded by myths. And when Ryan's family discovered the truth, they were shaken but determined to support him, telling him that illness could not define who he was. But the outside world was not so kind, because soon whispers spread through his school, neighbors avoided him, and even some friends turned away, frightened by stories that HIV could spread through a handshake or sharing food. And yet Ryan, though hurt, refused to let fear dictate his heart, for he still dreamed of going to school, playing with his friends, and living like any other teenager. But when the school board decided to ban him from classes, claiming he was a danger to others, Ryan felt like the walls of his world were closing in, and still he chose not to be silent, instead standing up with quiet strength, telling his story to anyone who would listen, explaining with honesty that the disease did not make him a monster, that he was still just a boy who wanted to learn, laugh, and live. And though he was shy by nature, his courage shone brighter than any spotlight, catching the attention of local reporters who wrote about the injustice he faced. And soon his small voice echoed across America, turning him into an unexpected hero. And while his classmates lived normal days filled with homework and games, Ryan found himself at the center of a national conversation, his young shoulders carrying the weight of a fight against prejudice and ignorance. Yet through it all he kept his gentle smile, never lashing out, never sinking into bitterness, but showing the world that kindness and truth could outshine even the darkest fear. And though he often grew tired from illness, he reminded himself and others that life was worth every moment, that courage was not about being fearless but about moving forward even when afraid. And as he walked through crowds of protesters holding signs against him, Ryan held his head high, knowing that someday his struggle would mean freedom for other children like him. Because sometimes history is not changed by kings or generals but by a boy with a quiet voice who refused to stop believing in the goodness of people. When Ryan White was told he could not return to his school because of his illness, it felt like the world had turned its back on him. For children whispered behind his back, parents in the community signed petitions against him, and some neighbors treated him like a stranger in his own hometown. But instead of breaking his spirit, this rejection only pushed him to rise stronger. And though his body was often weak from the effects of hemophilia and HIV, his voice carried a strength that no disease could silence, because Ryan decided to tell the truth in front of cameras, newspapers, and even lawmakers, explaining calmly that HIV could not be spread by touching, sharing food, or playing together, and that children like him deserved education and compassion, not fear and exile. And soon his courage turned him from an ordinary teenager into a national figure, appearing on television shows where he shared his story with a trembling honesty that touched millions. And while many still doubted, thousands more began to open their hearts, writing him letters of support and sending gifts to remind him he was not alone. And slowly, celebrities and leaders joined his cause, with famous musicians like Elton John befriending him and standing at his side, while even the President of the United States invited him to the White House. Listening as this boy, once banned from a classroom, explained how America needed to learn compassion. And through it all Ryan remained humble, insisting he was not a hero but just a kid who wanted to be normal, going to school, hanging out with friends, and living free from judgment. And though his health often declined, he pushed forward, attending proms, making speeches, and giving hope to thousands of families fighting the same battle. And when his story was shared in newspapers worldwide, people who once feared the disease began to see it differently, realizing it was not a punishment, not a curse, but a medical condition that demanded science and empathy, not hatred. And as Ryan grew older his fight became a symbol of change, leading to the creation of the Ryan White Care Act in 1990, a law that provided support and health care for people living with HIV/AIDS across America, ensuring no one else would be left alone as he had been. But sadly, Ryan's own life was cut short, for the illness eventually overwhelmed his body, and at just 18 years old he passed away, leaving behind a legacy far greater than his years. for his funeral was attended by thousands, and millions more mourned a boy who had shown the world that even a child's voice could shatter walls of prejudice. And in the days that followed, his story inspired countless campaigns, medical research, and laws that saved lives, proving that kindness can outlive fear. And even after decades, his name is remembered not as a victim but as a warrior of compassion, and the lesson his life left for children everywhere was simple yet eternal. Never let fear decide how you treat others, for illness does not define a person's worth, and one voice of truth, even from the youngest among us, can transform ignorance into understanding and darkness into light.